In 1964, a man faces the death penalty inside a South African courtroom. Instead of begging for clemency, he stares directly at the white judges and declares he is prepared to die. 3 decades later, that exact same prisoner walks out of his solitary cell to lead the very system that caged him. How does an individual entirely erased from society manage to bring the 20th century's most brutal segregationist regime to its knees without triggering a catastrophic civil war? The answer lies beyond the accepted public legend. He entered the prison as a saboteur and emerged as a global saint, but the reality between those points was far more complex than the sanitized myth. He navigated multiple identities to survive: a restless tribal aristocrat, a sharp Johannesburg lawyer, a fiery Africanist, and the underground commander of a shadow army. The apartheid machine he fought was engineered to crush human dignity daily, utilizing a strict legal framework to systematically degrade the native population. We will trace his evolution from the remote rural hills of the Transkei to the blinding lime quarry of Robben Island, and finally to the highest executive office in Pretoria. We will examine the heavy personal cost of his political ascent, exposing the profound tragedy of his marriage to Winnie, the underground networks he built with loyal comrades, and the intense secret negotiations with his ultimate political adversaries. His greatest victory was not simply surviving his confinement, but mastering his own rage to dismantle an empire through calculated reconciliation. So settle in as we uncover the life of the revolutionary, who recognized that the absolute hardest battles are won by controlling the terms of peace. This is the bedtime biography of Nelson Mandela. Chapter 1: The Runaway Prince. Long before he dismantled the apparatus of state power, he was intimately acquainted with its illusion. The story begins in 1918 within the rolling green hills of the Transkei in South Africa, in a village named Mvezo. A child was born to a wealthy, respected counselor of the Thembu royal house. The family named the boy Rolihlahla, a Xhosa word translating roughly to troublemaker. His father, Henry Gadla Mfakanyiswa, operated as a high-ranking advisor to the king. He possessed 4 wives, 13 children, and vast herds of cattle. He held immense local prestige. However, that localized authority was entirely theoretical. A trivial dispute regarding an ox arose with a white colonial magistrate. His father flatly refused to appear before the colonial court. For this single act of procedural defiance against a European official, the colonial state immediately stripped him of everything: his position, his land, his wealth. The family was forced into exile in a much poorer village. For young Rolihlahla, the lesson was permanent and devastating. It demonstrated exactly how fragile native power was under a colonial shadow. Wealth and status meant absolutely nothing if the overarching legal system was controlled by men who viewed you as biologically inferior. On his very first day of formal schooling, a teacher casually erased his identity, assigning him the English name Nelson. It was the standard administrative procedure of the colonial education system, treating native children as raw material to be standardized. When Nelson was 9, his father died. He was subsequently taken to the Great Place, the royal seat of the Thembu regent, Yongintaba Dalindyebo, who agreed to raise him. The Great Place was a complex intersection of traditional African royalty and Victorian aspiration. The regent drove a Ford V8, and the household functioned as a hybrid of Xhosa custom and British etiquette. It was here that Nelson observed the precise mechanics of political leadership. He attended tribal meetings where the regent sat in absolute silence, actively listening to every dissenting voice before offering a final consensus. Nelson later described this specific process as democracy in its purest form. He was sent to elite Methodist boarding schools where he absorbed Victorian manners, studied Latin, and learned to box. In 1939, he entered Fort Hare University, envisioning a comfortable, predictable life as a rural civil servant. But a dispute over student council elections triggered a boycott. Nelson was elected but refused to serve, standing in solidarity with the protest. The university principal threatened immediate expulsion, Nelson chose to leave. He returned to the Great Place, expecting a diplomatic resolution. Instead, the furious regent bypassed negotiation entirely, announcing he had unilaterally arranged marriages for both Nelson and his own son, Justice. The two young men immediately calculated their options. They stole 2 of the regent's prized oxen, sold them to a local trader, and used the cash to purchase train tickets. This was not simply a teenage rebellion against a forced wedding. It was a definitive rejection of a gilded cage. In 1941, Nelson boarded a train for Johannesburg, actively abandoning a guaranteed aristocratic future that lacked any genuine self-determination. He believed he was riding toward freedom. He had no concept of the brutal reality awaiting him in the city. Chapter 2. The Johannesburg Hustle. The collision between a rural aristocratic mindset and the grinding machinery of Johannesburg in 1941 was profound. The City of Gold was structured on extraction, maintained by curfews, passbooks, and police raids. The young runaway, carrying an assumed dignity but zero capital, was forced into a job as a night watchman at Crown Mines. He patrolled the perimeter, guarding the immense wealth of strangers while hundreds of African miners slept in concrete bunks. For a man raised observing open political debate at the Great Place, the transition to guarding a colonial extraction camp in the dead of night was a stark humiliation. The position dissolved quickly after the regent demanded his return. Nelson drifted into Alexandra, an impoverished township deprived of basic electricity, where he rented a single backyard room. He lived in absolute poverty. It was in Alexandra that his political trajectory fundamentally shifted. He met Walter Sisulu, a well-connected real estate agent operating within the severe restrictions placed on black property ownership. Sisulu was an active operative in the African National Congress, possessing a sharp eye for political talent. He instantly recognized the young man's potential. Sisulu became a mentor and a strategic operative, securing Nelson a clerical position at a white-owned law firm, which facilitated his enrollment as a part-time law student at the University of the Witwatersrand. The law firm provided an intimate education in systemic humiliation. A white secretary explicitly informed him there was no color bar, before immediately directing him to use separate teacups so he would not break the crockery reserved for whites. Another ordered him to run errands simply because of his skin color. Yet, the environment was not monolithic. He met white colleagues who shared their food and engaged in fierce, multiracial political debates late into the night. These interactions shattered his rural assumptions. He learned that racial divides could occasionally be bridged by ideological solidarity. By 1952, after years of grueling study, he qualified as an attorney. He and Oliver Tambo opened the first African-run law firm in the country. Their waiting room was permanently overflowing with men and women desperate for defense against passbook violations and police harassment. The practice generated professional prestige, but it simultaneously exposed a devastating paradox. He realized the absolute futility of using the law to protect his clients when the entire legal system was meticulously designed to oppress them. He had joined the ANC in 1944, deeply influenced by the fiery Africanist Anton Lembede, who argued exclusively for black self-liberation. Driven by an exhaustion with polite petitions, Nelson helped found the ANC Youth League to actively overthrow the conservative old guard. The system was not going to change through patient legal arguments. It required an equal and opposite physical force. The distinguished lawyer was preparing for a very different kind of confrontation. The collision between his rural aristocratic mindset and the human-crushing machinery of Johannesburg was immediate and severe. They called it the City of Gold, but it was a metropolis built entirely on extraction and held together by curfews and passbooks. Stripped of his royal protections, he was forced to take a job as a night watchman at a massive mining compound. The humiliation was profound. A young man, raised watching elders debate justice beneath open skies, was now holding a heavy wooden club, patrolling the dark perimeter of a labor camp. He was guarding the immense wealth of strangers, while thousands of African miners slept in concrete bunks, their labor actively enriching a system that despised them. The watchman job did not last. He drifted into Alexandra, an impoverished, unpaved settlement explicitly deprived of electricity by the government. He rented a single room in a backyard, sleeping on the bare dirt floor. It was in this desperate environment that his political trajectory permanently shifted. He crossed paths with Walter Sisulu. Sisulu was a highly connected real estate agent and an active operative within the African National Congress. He possessed a sharp eye for political talent and immediately recognized the raw potential in the runaway from the Transkei. Sisulu transformed into a mentor, securing him a position as an articled clerk at a white-owned law firm in the city. This job provided a crucial lifeline, allowing him to enroll as a part-time law student at the University of the Witwatersrand. The law firm functioned as an intimate education in systemic degradation. The daily interactions stripped away any lingering illusions about colonial benevolence. A white senior secretary explicitly told him there was no color bar in the office, then immediately instructed him to drink his tea from a separate cup in the hallway to avoid contaminating the white staff's crockery. Another treated the ambitious law clerk as a personal errand boy simply because of his skin color. Yet, the environment offered unexpected complexities. He encountered white colleagues who defied the rigid racial hierarchy, sharing their food and inviting him to multiracial gatherings where politics were debated late into the night. These specific interactions fractured his rural assumptions, revealing that ideological solidarity could occasionally cross the strict boundaries of race. By 1952, after years of grueling study and constant financial struggle, he finally qualified as an attorney. Partnering with his friend Oliver Tambo, he opened the first entirely African-run law firm in the country. Their waiting room was permanently packed with people desperate for defense against arbitrary evictions and relentless police harassment. The practice brought him significant local status, but it simultaneously exposed a cruel, unavoidable paradox. He quickly realized the absolute futility of utilizing the law to protect his clients, when the entire legal system was meticulously designed to strip them of their rights. A courtroom victory meant nothing if the foundational statutes were explicitly engineered to crush black aspiration. This stark legal reality directly fueled his political radicalization. He had formally joined the ANC in 1944, falling under the heavy influence of Anton Lembede, a fiery Africanist who argued exclusively for black self-liberation. Driven by a complete exhaustion with the polite, ineffective petitions of the conservative old guard, he co-founded the ANC Youth League. The intellectual debates were ending. The establishment of the Youth League was a definitive declaration that the apartheid system would never change through patience or legal maneuvering. It required an equal and opposite physical force. The distinguished lawyer in the tailored suit was actively preparing to discard his legal gown for a completely different method of confrontation. The system had pushed him past the point of peaceful negotiation. Chapter 3: The Young Lion. The illusion that legal representation could somehow dismantle colonial oppression evaporated entirely in 1948. The National Party swept into power on a singular, defining promise: apartheid. This was not simply a policy of segregation. It was a meticulous legal blueprint designed to guarantee permanent white supremacy and systematically crush black dignity on a daily basis. The established leadership of the ANC had spent decades writing polite petitions, waiting for diplomatic meetings that never materialized. Nelson and the Youth League seized control, forcibly removing the moderate president and pivoting the organization toward aggressive civil disobedience, strikes, and boycotts. Initially, his political ideology remained rigidly exclusive. He firmly rejected the involvement of communists and progressive whites, insisting that black liberation must be achieved solely by black Africans. This narrow nationalism was severely tested in 1950. During a May Day strike, police opened fire, killing 18 demonstrators. Nelson witnessed the aftermath. He saw white communists and Indian activists holding their positions against state violence. Standing before a structural machine designed to destroy human life, he realized ideological purity was a lethal luxury. He abandoned his strict Africanist stance, accepting a colder, pragmatic reality. To break the system, he needed to forge alliances with anyone actively fighting the state. This tactical evolution drove the 1952 Defiance Campaign. Appointed as National Volunteer-in-Chief, Nelson mobilized thousands to deliberately violate apartheid laws, intentionally overflowing the prison system. The campaign ultimately collapsed under a brutal government crackdown, but the strategic objective was achieved. ANC membership exploded to 100,000. The government responded by immediately banning him from public speaking and restricting his movements. Anticipating the inevitable total suppression of the movement, he drafted the M Plan, a structural blueprint designed to transition the ANC from public rallies into a decentralized, invisible network of underground street cells. He understood that the movement could not survive on public platforms much longer. The state's retaliation escalated. In 1956, he was swept up in the massive treason trial, a grueling 4-year legal battle designed to financially and psychologically drain the resistance. The immense pressure destroyed his first marriage. He returned to an empty house before a rapid courtship led to his marriage to Winnie Madikizela, a union that would face immediate and unrelenting state pressure. Then came Sharpeville. In March 1960, police massacred 69 unarmed demonstrators. The government immediately declared a state of emergency and banned the ANC entirely. When Nelson was released after months of detention, his law firm was shuttered, and his political organization was illegal. The era of protest placards and legal defense had definitively ended in gunfire. He discarded the tailored suits and the courtroom protocol. Recognizing that peaceful resistance was now mathematically impossible, the man they would call the Black Pimpernel slipped entirely into the shadows. Chapter 4. The Spear is Sharpened. His final public act of defiance before slipping away completely was precisely calculated. A week after the Sharpeville massacre, Nelson stood in Orlando with a group of press photographers carefully arranged around him. He produced his passbook, the mandatory, hated document specifically engineered to control African movement, and set it on fire. The cameras documented the flames. This was not an emotional outburst. It was a highly visible declaration that the era of compliance was permanently over. 2 days later, utilizing new emergency regulations, the police arrested him. He spent 5 months in Pretoria local prison, watching from his cell as his legal practice was shuttered, and the ANC was officially banned by the state. Upon his release in August, he immediately vanished. The organization had to be completely rebuilt in the shadows. He utilized safe houses, moving constantly, adopting disguises as a chauffeur, a chef, and a gardener. The press dubbed him the Black Pimpernel, a title he leveraged strategically, occasionally telephoning newsrooms from payphones simply to prove he was still operating freely. In May 1961, he organized a national stay-at-home strike. The government responded by deploying armored tanks into the townships. He called off the strike on its second day to prevent a massacre, but he publicly warned a British reporter that if the state met peaceful protest with naked military force, the resistance would alter its tactics entirely. That shift required intense internal negotiation. Nelson spent an entire day convincing Moses Kotane, a key communist leader who feared the inevitable state repression. He then traveled to Natal to meet Chief Albert Luthuli, the ANC president and a committed pacifist. Nelson argued that defensive violence was the only remaining option, eventually securing Luthuli's reluctant blessing to establish an entirely separate military wing. They named it Umkhonto Wesizwe, or MK, the Spear of the Nation. The decision for a respected attorney to embrace armed struggle was not born of madness, but of cold political mathematics. Operating from a thatched cottage at Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, Disguised as a gardener named David, he studied military strategy deep into the night. He read Clausewitz and analyzed the guerrilla tactics of Boer generals. The military structure was rudimentary. He practiced with an air rifle and helped construct crude explosives. However, the strategic objective was highly sophisticated. Nelson and his inner circle deliberately chose sabotage as their primary tactic, explicitly targeting economic infrastructure, power stations, rail lines, and government offices, while strictly avoiding human casualties. This was not blind vengeance. It was calculated coercion. The sabotage campaign was meticulously designed to inflict severe financial damage, shatter the confidence of international investors, and ultimately force the apartheid government to the negotiating table. It was a diplomatic strategy weaponized through covert violence. On December 16, 1961, MK launched its first coordinated attacks across the country. The manifesto declared that the time had come to either submit or fight, but homemade explosives were insufficient to dismantle the state apparatus. To escalate the pressure, the commander of MK realized he needed capital, weaponry, and international backing. That required leaving the country illegally, abandoning his family, and stepping onto the global stage. Chapter 5: The Black Pimpernel. Exiting South African territory required a complete reinvention of his identity. Under the scorching January sun of 1962, holding a false passport and operating under the alias David Motsamai, the underground commander successfully crossed the border into Botswana. He was no longer merely a domestic fugitive. He was systematically transforming himself into the unofficial diplomat of a nation that did not yet legally exist. At an international conference in Ethiopia, he executed a highly strategic diplomatic maneuver. Addressing the gathered delegates, he explicitly argued that North African Arabs were fundamentally African, deliberately bridging the continental divide to construct a massive, unified coalition against colonial rule. This diplomatic offensive was relentless. Over the following months, he engaged directly with 13 separate heads of state. He secured strict commitments for financial and military support from Senegal and Guinea, and received £5,000 directly from the president of Tunisia. In Morocco, he embedded himself with the Algerian guerrilla commanders who had successfully fought the French military to a brutal standstill. They provided critical ideological instruction. A revolution must be unified, and political education is vastly more important than pure militarism. Expanding his operational theater, he traveled to London. He navigated the corridors of British political power, meeting key opposition figures and courting the press to build a formidable international media front. He recognized that this conflict required global intervention. It could not be won solely in the townships of Johannesburg. Returning to Ethiopia, the 43-year-old lawyer submitted to intense physical military training, mastering demolitions and automatic weaponry. However, the international campaign was abruptly terminated after only 2 weeks. An urgent encoded telegram arrived from Walter Sisulu demanding his immediate return. The internal movement was fracturing under intense state pressure and dangerous rumors of his permanent defection. He smuggled himself back into South Africa, burying his Ethiopian military uniform and a semi-automatic pistol at the Rivonia farm. He delivered a harsh, realistic assessment to the ANC leadership. The international community viewed them with deep suspicion, perceiving the movement as heavily manipulated by white communists. The organization desperately needed to project authentic African authority. Yet, the prolonged success of his evasion had bred a fatal overconfidence. Despite severe warnings, he insisted on traveling to Natal for a personal briefing with Chief Luthuli. After 17 months of flawless operational security, the Black Pimpernel became careless. He attended social gatherings and spoke openly about guerrilla tactics. On August 5, 1962, the state intelligence apparatus finally snapped shut. The vehicle he was driving, disguised as a chauffeur, was abruptly intercepted by security forces outside Howick. The era of the Phantom Commander concluded instantly on the roadside. The authorities confiscated a diary containing precise documentation of his international meetings. It was undeniable, physical evidence of his conspiracy against the state, providing the exact legal ammunition the government needed to completely destroy the movement. Chapter 6. The Trial of the Century. The state had secured its physical evidence, but a legal apparatus constructed purely on coercion instantly loses its authority the moment a defendant completely rejects its legitimacy. While held at the Fort Prison in Johannesburg, Joe Slovo presented Nelson with a meticulously planned escape route involving bribed policemen and unlocked cells. Nelson analyzed the logistics and ordered the plans destroyed. He recognized that running would validate the state's narrative. He made a cold, strategic calculation. He would remain, intentionally transforming the courtroom into a massive, global media front. On October 13, 1963, he entered the Pretoria court. He did not wear a suit. He wore a traditional leopard skin kaross, the ceremonial garment of Xhosa royalty. It was a precise visual provocation. It explicitly denied the image of a cowering criminal, projecting instead the absolute authority of an indigenous prince, placing the colonial state itself on trial. He conducted his own defense, immediately demanding the magistrate's recusal. He systematically interrogated the core legitimacy of a system where a black man was judged by a white magistrate, prosecuted by a white lawyer, and guarded by white orderlies under laws he had absolutely no right to vote on. The system had no legal answer that would not simultaneously indict itself. He was sentenced to 5 years. Shortly after, the situation escalated from containment to a matter of survival. In July 1963, police raided Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, capturing the entire high command of MK. They seized tactical documents outlining guerrilla warfare and submarine landings. Nelson was brought from his cell to join his comrades as accused conspirator number 1. The state was no longer seeking imprisonment. It was actively pursuing the death penalty for high treason. On April 20, 1964, rather than facing cross-examination, he elected to read a prepared statement directly from the dock. For 4 hours, he dismantled the state's accusations, calmly admitting to the formation of MK while explicitly denying communist alignment. Then, he delivered a heavily calculated conclusion that fundamentally paralyzed the prosecution. He stated he had fought against both white domination and black domination, dedicating his life to the ideal of a democratic society. He paused, looked at the judges, and declared that if necessary, it was an ideal for which he was fully prepared to die. By publicly and unapologetically embracing the maximum penalty, he completely neutralized the state's ultimate weapon of terror. The apartheid government was instantly trapped in an impossible contradiction. Executing him would immediately create a globally worshipped, immortal martyr. Imprisoning him would simply incubate a living legend. The judges retreated. They issued a sentence of life imprisonment. Under the cover of darkness, avoiding the massive crowds gathered in Pretoria, the leadership of the resistance was loaded onto a military aircraft. As they flew over the dark Atlantic toward the blinding limestone quarries of Robben Island, they ceased being active commanders. The state intended to erase them from history, burying them alive on a rock designed to break men. They had survived the gallows, but they were now entering a completely different mechanism of destruction. Chapter 7. Island of Ghosts. The mechanics of his punishment were not simply about geographic isolation. The architecture of Robben Island was explicitly engineered to erase memory and methodically crush the human spirit. Arriving in the dead of night, the prisoners were immediately screamed at by warders promising that this was the exact place they would die. The initial command was a demand for total submission. The men were ordered to strip naked on the dock. When a guard moved to physically strike a prisoner, Nelson immediately stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He coldly informed the guard that any physical assault would result in immediate legal action. It was a calculated establishment of boundaries on his very first night. He was confined to Section B, a block of minuscule solitary cells measuring roughly 6 by 7 feet. He slept on a concrete floor with a single mat and 3 thin blankets, an arrangement that would remain unchanged for over a decade. Every aspect of their existence was micromanaged to enforce degradation. The nutritional intake was strictly weaponized along racial lines. As an African prisoner, Nelson received the absolute worst rations, deliberately inferior to the food provided to Indian or colored inmates. The psychological attrition was constant. The physical labor in the blinding white lime quarry permanently destroyed his tear ducts because the authorities repeatedly refused requests for basic sunglasses. However, maintaining control over a prison population is a psychological equation. Nelson recognized that preserving absolute personal discipline regarding the smallest details was a supreme technique of resistance. He initiated a prolonged campaign against the mandatory issue of short trousers. The government intended to visually infantilize grown African men by forcing them into schoolboy clothing. He relentlessly argued against the indignity until the administration finally issued him long trousers. He refused to wear them until every other man in his section received the exact same provision. He subsequently refused to participate in the humiliating naked search rituals required by the guards, eventually forcing the administration to exempt the entire political section. The deepest wounds inflicted by the state were entirely personal. In 1969, he was informed that his eldest son had been killed in a car accident. His formal request to attend the funeral was flatly denied. That night, he simply stood at the tiny square window of his cell, staring into the absolute darkness, refusing to sleep or eat. His mother died, and again, he was denied the right to bury her. The state also severed his connection to Winnie, utilizing severe mainland banning orders to prevent her from visiting him for 2 entire years. When they were finally permitted to speak, it was strictly through a thick glass partition via monitored headphones, and the line was immediately cut if they attempted to speak in Xhosa. He maintained his sanity by meticulously dusting a single photograph of her every morning. The lime dust wrecked their lungs, and the isolation fractured their families. But the relentless, silent resistance inside Section B proved that the colonial machine could not successfully break their minds. Chapter 8. Master of the Prison. Surviving the crushing isolation of Robben Island required more than mere physical endurance. It demanded a total inversion of the existing power structure. Officially, the warders governed Section B. In reality, a clandestine high organ, composed of 5 senior ANC leaders including Nelson and Walter Sisulu, operated as a shadow administration. They established what the prisoners called the university. Utilizing the blinding lime quarry as a lecture hall, Nelson systematically educated the younger inmates on political theory and the history of the resistance while they swung picks in the dust. Written materials were meticulously composed at night and smuggled into the general population, utilizing false-bottomed food drums and hollowed-out toilet paper rolls. The prison administration searched relentlessly, but discovered almost nothing. The internal dynamics of this captive community were inherently volatile. In the mid-1970s, a massive influx of young, fiercely radicalized prisoners arrived following the Soweto uprising. These teenagers viewed the ANC elders as obsolete moderates who had fundamentally failed. They demanded immediate, uncompromising confrontation. While other senior leaders advocated for strict discipline to crush this rebellion, Nelson pivoted. He engaged the youth in extensive, unhurried dialogue, slowly deconstructing their romanticized view of armed conflict. He grounded them in the harsh logistical reality that a guerrilla force could not militarily defeat the heavily armored South African state in open combat. The explicit goal of the armed struggle was always to force political negotiations. He utilized the patience he had learned at the Great Place to systematically pull a fractured, angry generation back into a cohesive, long-term strategic alignment. However, his most sophisticated psychological operation was deployed not against his comrades, but directly against his captors. The warders arrived on the island programmed to dehumanize the prisoners. Nelson responded by executing a calculated campaign of radical empathy. He learned to speak fluent Afrikaans. He extensively researched Afrikaner history and culture, intentionally neutralizing their deepest insecurities. He initiated conversations about their families and their personal grievances. He recognized that these men, despite their uniforms, were fundamentally isolated and often poorly educated. He eventually secured permission to cultivate a small garden within the prison courtyard. He studied horticulture with absolute precision, ultimately producing thousands of tomatoes and chilies. He did not hoard this harvest. He strategically gifted the produce directly to the warders. This seemingly simple agricultural exchange functioned as a highly effective diplomatic tool. It established an invisible psychological debt, fundamentally altering the dynamic between the guarded and the guard. The relationship with one specific censor, James Gregory, evolved to the point where Nelson was actively assisting warders in drafting their own professional promotion essays. This systematic dismantling of the warders' hostility culminated in a staggering shift in authority. When a newly appointed commanding officer arrived attempting to reimpose severe discipline, the effort completely collapsed. Nelson simply negotiated a pragmatic treaty. The prisoners would maintain the outward appearance of labor, and in exchange, the administration would essentially leave them alone. The men tasked with breaking the political prisoners had instead been carefully managed and effectively neutralized by the sheer gravitational pull of one man's calculated intellect. The state had built the cage, but the prisoner had completely taken control of the keys. Chapter 9. The Myth and the Wife. While the state attempted to neutralize the husband on an isolated island, they simultaneously moved to eradicate his wife's influence on the mainland. In 1977, security forces transported Winnie Mandela to Brandfort, a deeply conservative rural town without running water. They intended to bury her politically. It was a massive miscalculation. She aggressively converted her internal exile into a highly visible center of resistance, actively courting the international press. Instead of silencing her, the government inadvertently provided her with a global platform. This coincided with a deliberate massive shift in resistance strategy. In 1980, the Free Mandela campaign launched. The objective was highly specific. Rather than attempting to mobilize the international community around abstract principles of human rights, the movement would center its entire focus on one specific, imprisoned individual. The result was unprecedented. By 1988, 250,000 people gathered at Wembley Stadium for a tribute concert. He was rapidly transforming into the world's most famous political prisoner, a sanitized secular saint printed on T-shirts globally. Most of these supporters had absolutely no knowledge of his actual political philosophies or his history of guerrilla warfare. The myth had completely eclipsed the physical man. However, the agonizing cost of this symbolic elevation was borne directly by his marriage. While the international media elevated Winnie as the dignified face of the resistance, the brutal reality on the ground in South Africa was deteriorating rapidly. Returning to Soweto in defiance of her banning orders, she established the Mandela Football Club. It was not an athletic organization. It operated essentially as a private, heavily armed militia functioning out of her backyard. The situation quickly degenerated. The group engaged in extreme violence, abduction, and internal turf wars. The absolute breaking point occurred in December 1988 with the abduction and murder of Stompie Sipe, a 14-year-old activist falsely accused of acting as a police informant. The evidence implicating her immediate circle was undeniable. The mass democratic movement, the primary internal resistance coalition, took the virtually unprecedented step of publicly censuring the wife of their most venerated leader. From his heavily monitored cell, Nelson was agonizingly aware of the collapse. He sent urgent private letters begging her to dismantle the violent apparatus surrounding her. Yet, publicly, he maintained absolute stoic support. His private correspondence reveals a profound, devastating disconnect. he continued to write letters filled with intense romantic longing, attempting to preserve a domestic reality that had been fundamentally destroyed decades earlier. He was holding on to a frozen memory. Winnie was operating in a vicious, highly compromised urban battlefield, publicly maintaining a relationship with a young lawyer 27 years her junior. The man had been perfectly transmuted into an untouchable global messiah, while simultaneously becoming entirely powerless to protect the wife who had fought alongside him. The political symbol had never been more powerful, but the personal reality was completely shattered. Chapter 10. Tea with the Enemy. As the myth surrounding him expanded globally, the state recognized they could no longer keep him buried on an island. In March 1982, Nelson and his closest comrades were transferred to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. 3 years later, President P.W. Botha offered a highly conditional freedom. Nelson could leave prison immediately if he publicly renounced the armed struggle. The response was delivered via his daughter Zinzi to a packed stadium. He completely rejected the offer, establishing a fundamental negotiating principle. He stated that only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts. Yet, operating entirely outside the knowledge of his own high command, he was already initiating the endgame. In 1985, while recovering from surgery in a hospital ward, he covertly opened a direct channel with the apartheid government. This was an extraordinarily dangerous calculation. By unilaterally engaging with the oppressor, he risked being permanently branded a traitor by the movement he had built. He reasoned that true leadership occasionally requires stepping far ahead of the collective, absorbing the absolute maximum risk to break a catastrophic deadlock. The strategy was built on psychological disarmament. During his first clandestine meeting with Justice Minister Kobe Coetzee, Nelson utilized his old-world aristocratic politeness. He greeted his jailer with overwhelming, disarming courtesy, completely shattering the minister's expectation of a hardened, combative radical. Following this encounter, he was relocated to a separate wing at Pollsmoor, physically isolated from his furious comrades. He insisted the separation was necessary. The space allowed him to conduct 47 secret meetings over the next 4 years, sparring intellectually with state officials and the chief of intelligence over the mechanics of a transition to majority rule. In 1988, after surviving tuberculosis, he was moved again, this time to a private, heavily guarded bungalow at Victor Verster Prison. The physical cage had been heavily gilded, complete with a swimming pool and a personal chef, but he meticulously maintained his personal discipline, insisting on making his own bed and washing his own dishes. In July 1989, he was covertly transported to the presidential office to meet P.W. Botha. Before entering, he forced his prison commander to knot his tie, refusing to meet the head of state wearing what he termed a hangman's noose. The historic meeting was bizarrely cordial. They drank tea and discussed Afrikaner history, but Botha conceded no actual political ground. A month later, Botha was ousted, replaced by F.W. de Klerk, a pragmatic conservative whom Nelson initially viewed as unremarkable. Their initial engagements were devoid of charm, consisting strictly of clinical political calculation. Nelson demanded a tangible gesture of good faith to legitimize the process: the immediate, unconditional release of Walter Sisulu and the other Rivonia trialists. De Klerk complied in October. The senior leadership walked free. Nelson remained entirely isolated within the boundaries of his gilded bungalow. He was the final piece remaining on the board. Chapter 11. Walking Free. The solitary game he had played against the state finally concluded on February 11, 1990. After 27 years, Nelson walked out of Victor Verster Prison. The world anticipated the emergence of the young, defiant boxer from the 1960s photographs. Instead, they witnessed a thin, silver-haired statesman. The reality of his release was immediate chaos. Millions of people flooded the streets, swamping his motorcade in a desperate, uncontrollable surge of enthusiasm. His first public address from the Cape Town City Hall balcony was a masterclass in managing conflicting expectations. Reading through his wife's borrowed glasses, he did not deliver a soft message of immediate forgiveness. He explicitly reaffirmed the necessity of the armed struggle. This rhetoric was not directed at the international community or the white establishment. It was a strictly calibrated message aimed directly at the radicalized youth and the hardliners within MK. He needed to prove unequivocally that his decades in a gilded cage had not compromised his fundamental militant resolve. However, the country he re-entered was not simply celebrating, it was actively bleeding. A brutal, multi-factional war was tearing through the Natal province, pitting the ANC-aligned movement against the Zulu nationalist Inkatha Freedom Party. This conflict was not entirely organic. Undeniable evidence confirmed that state security forces were covertly funding and arming Inkatha to destabilize the resistance. Death squads operated freely in the townships. To break this escalating cycle of violence, Nelson executed a maneuver that enraged his own supporters. In August 1990, he aggressively pressured the ANC to formally suspend all armed operations. The organizational ranks felt deeply betrayed, viewing it as a massive capitulation. But Nelson understood the strategic reality. The physical suspension of violence was the absolute prerequisite for compelling the apartheid government into genuine constitutional negotiations. It was an incredibly unpopular, necessary concession to save the transition process. As the street violence continued unchecked, his previously cold but functional relationship with President de Klerk completely fractured. The man who had patiently drunk tea with his captors now openly accused the head of state of orchestrating a double agenda, publicly declaring that de Klerk had blood on his hands. He had secured his physical freedom, but he was now forced to navigate a nation perfectly poised on the edge of a catastrophic civil war. Chapter 12. Saving the Peace. The suspension of the armed struggle was a calculated risk that nearly destroyed the movement from within. As negotiations stagnated, the country rapidly descended into a localized civil war. Following the state-backed massacres at Boipatong and Bisho, where dozens were slaughtered, the internal pressure on Nelson became critical. Arriving at the disaster sites, he was confronted by enraged crowds demanding weapons, screaming that they were completely finished with peace talks. He did not appease them. He responded with absolute cold authority, stating that if they intended to kill innocent people, they did not belong in his organization. He understood that mass insurrection would merely provide the state with the exact justification it needed to deploy the military. To break the stalemate, the resistance implemented a highly controversial strategy orchestrated by the communist leader Joe Slovo, the Sunset Clauses. This involved a tactical retreat. The ANC formally proposed a temporary power-sharing structure and, crucially, guaranteed total job security and pensions for the white civil servants, police, and military personnel operating the apartheid state. This was not a capitulation. It was an incredibly sophisticated piece of political engineering designed specifically to prevent the outgoing regime from completely sabotaging the national infrastructure before handing it over. The fragility of this arrangement was fundamentally tested in April 1993 when Chris Hani, an immensely popular militant ANC leader, was assassinated in his driveway by a far-right extremist. The nation instantly teetered on the absolute edge of a full-scale racial war. In that terrifying vacuum, the sitting president was politically paralyzed. It was Nelson Mandela who commanded the national television broadcast. He deployed his moral authority to stabilize a population demanding vengeance, reminding the country that while a white extremist pulled the trigger, it was a white Afrikaner woman who had immediately identified the killer to the police. That specific broadcast marked the definitive transfer of executive power. He was acting as the president long before the election occurred. He deployed the exact same psychological control against the heavily armed right-wing generals who were openly preparing for war. He invited them to tea, acknowledging their military superiority while calmly detailing the demographic impossibility of their victory. By late 1993, the interim constitution was finalized, incorporating the strategic compromises necessary for a bloodless transition. In April 1994, the ANC secured a massive electoral victory. The man who had been intended to die entirely forgotten on a limestone rock was sworn in as the president of a new republic, completely absorbing the architects of his imprisonment into his own administration. Chapter 13. The Rainbow President. On May 10, 1994, the world witnessed the inauguration of South Africa's first black president. Standing at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, the precise location where decades of systemic oppression had been engineered, Nelson delivered an address quoting an Afrikaner poet. It was a highly deliberate, calculated choice, instantly weaving Afrikaner culture into the foundation of the new state. He declared his commitment to building a rainbow nation. He immediately backed this rhetoric with strategic personnel decisions, retaining the white finance ministers and central bank governors of the apartheid regime. While radical factions within his own party grumbled about excessive appeasement, he understood that stabilizing a fractured society required profound psychological management. He invited the wives of former apartheid architects, including the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the literal creator of the segregation system, to the presidential residence for tea. This was not a display of weakness. It was an overwhelming demonstration of the victor's magnanimity, actively disarming lingering reactionary sentiments. The absolute zenith of this symbolic statesmanship occurred during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. The Springboks rugby team had long functioned as a deeply despised symbol of white dominance. Nelson walked onto the field wearing the team's green and gold jersey, actively urging the black majority to embrace them. He was consciously weaponizing a symbol of former oppression to forge national unity. While he flawlessly executed the role of the unifying figurehead, he deliberately delegated the daily, complex mechanics of government administration to his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. He recognized that his primary utility was serving as the sole cohesive force preventing a multi-layered society from tearing itself apart during its most volatile transition phase. He endorsed market-friendly economic policies and established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to systematically process the atrocities of the past. He also fiercely maintained his diplomatic loyalty to figures like Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi, explicitly informing Western powers that their geopolitical enemies were not automatically his. Critics argued he focused too heavily on symbols, while economic inequality persisted. But the reality was that managing the psychological trauma of a newly liberated nation was the absolute critical foundation required for the state to survive its first fragile years. Chapter 14. The Final Act. The public triumph of the new republic masked the absolute devastation of his private life. The marriage, sustained for decades by written correspondence and political mythology, could not survive the reality of cohabitation. In 1992, Nelson formally announced his separation from Winnie. By 1996, the estrangement was finalized in a divorce court. The proceedings were brutally public, exposing letters detailing her infidelity with a young lawyer and her misappropriation of organizational funds. Standing before the judge, the man universally adored by millions stated quietly that since his release from prison, his wife had never once entered their bedroom while he was awake. He confessed he was the loneliest man in the world. Yet, in his twilight years, he found an unexpected reprieve. On his 80th birthday, he married Graça Machel, the highly accomplished widow of the former Mozambican president. She was a fiercely independent woman who initially resisted his courtship, fearing the erasure of her own identity within his massive shadow. Nelson deployed the same relentless patience he had utilized to dismantle the apartheid state, eventually securing a quiet, genuine happiness that had eluded him for decades. In 1999, he executed his most profound democratic maneuver. He voluntarily relinquished executive power after a single term. In a continent historically plagued by leaders clinging indefinitely to office, this intentional departure established an unprecedented standard of political restraint. He retired to the rural hills of Kunu. Fascinatingly, the residence he constructed there was not a sprawling palace, but a precise architectural replica of the final prison bungalow he had occupied at Victor Verster. His retirement was highly active. He immediately assumed the role of chief mediator in the complex Burundi peace process, leveraging his immense moral capital to force opposing factions into a settlement. Simultaneously, he recognized the devastating internal threat of HIV/AIDS, explicitly criticizing his own administration's previous inaction. When his last surviving son died of the disease in 2005, he did not hide the cause. He stood before the media and publicly announced that his son had succumbed to AIDS. He had been denied the right to bury his mother and his firstborn son while imprisoned. Now, he utilized the tragedy of his second son's death to publicly obliterate the societal stigma surrounding the virus. He demonstrated that even the deepest personal grief could be weaponized to protect the living. He told an anecdote in his later years about an encounter with a tourist in the Bahamas. The man had approached him directly and asked quite earnestly what exactly he was famous for. Mandela found the interaction genuinely amusing. He frequently expressed the hope that when he eventually died, people would not have to ask. History possesses a persistent, almost desperate tendency to sand down the sharp edges of extraordinary individuals, forcing them into the rigid, flawless molds of secular saints. He actively and consistently rejected this messianic label until the end. He stated plainly that he was an ordinary man who was forced into leadership by extraordinary circumstances. "My greatness," he observed, "is a creation of the collective imagination." He understood this dynamic perfectly. The strategist who had so meticulously weaponized his own mythology to dismantle an empire recognized that all legends are ultimately collaborative fictions. Forcing him into the role of a flawless deity entirely obscures the brutal, tactical reality of his survival. He did not defeat the crushing apparatus of the apartheid state through divine intervention or moral purity. He defeated it through an agonizingly cultivated patience, a brilliant, ruthless aptitude for political negotiation, and the strategic capacity to force catastrophic compromises at the exact right moment. The long walk was finally over. He successfully completely re-engineered a violently oppressive social order without driving the nation into widespread mutual destruction. The legacy he left behind was a country that was legally free, but still deeply fractured. A functioning democracy constructed directly upon a political miracle that he had personally designed. His ultimate significance does not reside in personal perfection. The true lesson is entirely pragmatic. The most absolute form of power does not lie in the physical capacity to eradicate your enemies, but in the psychological ability to force them to fundamentally alter their nature so that you can both survive. When the global mourning eventually faded, what remained was not a polished marble statue. It was simply a man who loved and lost deeply, a man who still meticulously made his own bed every morning, and a man who, in the final accounting, merely wanted to be remembered as someone who had fulfilled his duty.